I think you can hear me clearly, all sides of the room. So welcome back to the first substantive session of the event. You've heard from ministers, or a minister, and you've heard from what's been taking place. So we're going to try and break this down in the obvious, what does it mean and what do you think of it specifically session. I'm sure it's got a very formal title in your program, but that's an underlying thought. And we've assembled an assembly of individuals who are, I think, qualified to talk about that. Subject to the program, we've obviously had to move the cast list around slightly. We've been coping with a combination of weekend car accidents, student demonstrations, and waves of COVID. But nonetheless, we've got a distinguished panel sat to my right. I'm going to introduce them if they need any introduction very quickly. Their biographies are available for you to read in your own time. Mary O'Kane, as you know, chaired the Accord panel, and she sat right down there. Sat next to her is Kylie Austin, who, amongst other things, sits on the advisory board of the centre that I direct. But when she's not doing that, she runs something called EPHEA, which is the practitioner body for equity in higher education in Australia. And we work fairly closely with them on a variety of things. Sat next to her, moving down, we have Verity Firth. Verity and I have known each other from about the time of that meeting a year ago. I think she was sat to one side. She's at UNSW, by the way, just moved there. But never mind that. She sat on one side. I was coping with Sean, Paul Harper's dog, on the other side. And I think we had a pretty good conversation about what's this all about from there onwards. But it's been a real pleasure to work with Verity in that period. Sat next to her, as you know, is Harlene Hayne, the Vice-Chancellor of Curtin and chair of our board. And then lastly, the bloke near me is Barney Glover, formerly the landlord of this building. He was the Vice-Chancellor of a university called WSU. You may have heard of it. He's now moved on to become the Commissioner for Jobs and Skills?
Yes, it is.
Jobs and Skills Australia, JSA, the Commissioner for that, which is not unrelated to some of our discussions. So look, that's the cast list. I want to start to break this down. I'm going to ask each member of our panelists to spend 5 or 6 minutes just sort of laying out their stall. And if they can concentrate on maybe 1 or 2 recommendations that caught their eye and sort of expound on them for the benefit of the audience. And I think what we're really interested in is folk telling us a little bit about the recommendations that they felt are really good at tightly anchoring future positive equity outcomes. The ones that are, by definition, indirect ways of getting there, but equally important in many ways. And also a whole host of things that have already cropped up, which are to do with sort of implementation issues, whether in the foreground, how do you do this, how do you do that, or in the background, much more to do with the sort of structure and remit of ATEC. All those things are sensible ways to break this down. But why don't we get that ball rolling? And I'm going to ask Mary in particular to start that conversation. She's going to tell us a little bit about the thinking behind the recommendations. Off you go, Mary.
All right. Thanks, Shamit, and thank you all for your contributions to the Accord. It is wonderful to be here 1 year later. As Shamit just said, it was decided I'd talk a bit about the thinking of the Accord with regard to access and equity issues. So I've sort of pulled things out, and I've got to remember to sort of go lightly through some things because Barney's taking them up, and we need to apologise for Fiona, who's had a bit shaken after an accident, and so Barney and I will cover regional issues too. So where did it all start? Well, it started with the terms of reference. The Minister made it very, very clear with the second term of reference that equity was a really big issue. And we, as a panel, we were all country kids. We'd all gone to university from country towns, not in country towns, but it had to travel. We had no trouble in thinking increasing the equity numbers and getting closer to what we very early on called population parity was a really good thing. But at the same time, we were also looking at the first term of reference, which was about the skills needs of Australia, and we commissioned research on what those numbers were needed to meet the requirements that the government was talking about. And when you looked at it, you could see that it wasn't a million miles away from what you need to do to get to population parity in the access side. And we started to see that the two probably should be linked, particularly looking at the soft demand for universities at the moment, that where were the students going to come from if we were going to do this great growth to meet the skills needs? And the obvious place was the equity story. So that then we had the sort of tagline, almost the tagline of the review was skills through equity, which, as Ben often says, sounds like a horse. So that became a sort of a really main theme running through. And we spent a lot of time coming back over equity issues. One was the definition of equity groups, so obviously low SES, First Nations, disabled, rural, regional, rural and remote, and Fiona always emphasises you must use the 3 Rs. But also, and we heard a bit about this morning, there are other groups that we mustn't forget about: care leavers, children of refugees, the incarcerated. It's really important to think about that wider equity thing, and I just wanted to drop that there so that we don't forget about it in these couple of days. Another big part of our thinking on equity that was landed moderately early, and helped by the thing a year ago here, was that we started to talk about 4 main pillars of the equity story. One about aspiration, and Barney will particularly pick that up and talk that the incredible importance of, you know, making sure tiny tots want to go to university, and that, you know, parents, school teachers, everyone is involved in part of that story. Then there's the issue of getting into uni if you fell out of school. What are the entry paths? And fee-free uni ready, very hard to say, I think is a wonderful thing. And you read in the report how we talk particularly about it, not just in the general, but there's need for aspects of it, for example, maths online for everyone, because in many regional areas the teaching of maths to high enough levels in high school is impossible, and kids then are barred from things like engineering, or it's hard to do it in minimum time. So the whole issue of helping people into entry is an incredibly important part. The next bit, and again the Minister touched on it, is the scaffolding. The third thing is this scaffolding idea that equity students typically, you know better than I, typically drop out at higher rates than other students. And how do we make sure there is that support for them, the mental support, the teaching, the learning support and everything? And how do we make sure that funding goes to that, the funding is used for the right thing? And then the last one of the 4 was removing roadblocks. And if you read our student chapter, that was particularly about that. And, you know, helping them get work while they're studying, the jobs broker idea, helping with the paid prac. Placement poverty was something that really worried us. And I should say more generally that poverty in students was something that worried us incredibly. The number of people who were eating, you know, instant noodles and living with 14 people sharing houses that came through the review was really startling and incredibly worrying. So supporting them, and that's why there's all those income support recommendations to try and help so students get a fairer deal even out of government systems that have become as crusty and rusty as the HECS had. So we want that fixed. So another part of our thinking then, of course, became funding. So there's a couple of really important aspects to the funding model. I won't go through the whole thing, but some from an equity point of view. One was loading for equity, needs-based funding, and slightly different forms of loading for rural and regional and remote, but for all equity groups that there's that funding. And that gives an incredible opportunity for universities, that there'll be more funding in the system with those students. And so that will, I think, be a wonderful opportunity for unis there. The other thing is, what does it really cost to study whatever? So one of the things we were keen on was a pricing authority, and saw that under the general shepherding of the Tertiary Education Commission. And it's one of the reasons Stephen Duckett is on the advisory committee, because as the great godfather of pricing for health in Australia, he knows a lot about that, and of course is a pro-chancellor at RMIT, so he knows universities well too. And that itself will help us work out what the right needs-based funding is. And it won't be just one-off, like the former arrangements under the DORCA, the relative funding model. It will be a dynamic system that keeps going. And the whole concept is to get rid of the marginal funding area, so that there's not, that you're just taking on the odd extra equity student at minimal costs. No, that full costs. And this can be taken into all sorts of things. It does mean that the system should be able to afford even specialist, we talk about specialist universities that would be shepherded under the ATEC. You might find a university that is only for equity students and that specialises in getting them to certain levels from which they might move. There's lots of opportunities could happen from there. ATEC was an important part of our thinking in equity because it is the idea of a system steward that helps steward these reforms into place and keeps it going and makes sure the funding is going to the right place. Some other important things, but before I wrap up, were the issue of the links to sort of TAFE and to VET and the skills infrastructure issues, all sorts of articulation arrangements, but in the skills infrastructure we've got things like the skills passport, recognition of prior learning, something that's been around for 40 years, is something we've been trying to solve and haven't solved, but should. The Minister talked about the study hubs. They were implemented some time ago, they were devised some time ago, but we think they're such a good idea, we recommended more, and that's been taken up. Now, a few other things about, sort of other important things around this. The growth for the skills area means incredible growth in staff numbers. So that's something that needs to be thought out, and we didn't have a lot of time to write a lot about it in the Accord, but needs to be thought about in this part. And how do you make sure that new university teachers and researchers are really good in the equity space? How do we make sure we put a lot of emphasis on saying training university staff to be good teachers, but how do we make sure they're great teachers for the equity side? How do we make sure the whole community is great at inspiring the aspiration side? School teachers, media, the university teaching community. How do we actually really press that aspiration thing, which I'll then leave to Barney? And in research, how do we make sure we're doing enough research on equity, on access and these issues? Now, Shamit, your centre is doing wonderful things, but we probably need lots more people doing lots more things, and we need to make sure Australia is the very best place in access equity issues so that internationally people will be flocking here to know how to do it. The other thing that I think is really important is that we make sure we look at particular equity questions for the teaching of certain disciplines. Often when you look at surges in equity students, you find them in certain disciplines, often the care economy, sometimes teaching and things, but how do we make sure it's reflected in engineering, medicine, the humanities? And I think that's important. And that brings me to the last thing I want to talk about that we thought through is measurement. How do we know we'll be succeeding? So what do we know that we need to measure? For example, aspiration. It's hard to measure aspiration, and there's ways you can come at it indirectly, but how do we know as a nation we're good at building aspiration in the tiny tots? How do we make sure, as I said, that we do have enough people coming through the right disciplines? That's easier to measure, but we really do want to see people succeeding really well. I think of a mate of mine, Jason Sharples, who's Professor of Applied Maths at UNSW ADFA. He's a Bundjalung man and he's the world expert in extreme fire, who is rarely in Australia because he's always being used by Greece or California or somewhere doing things. We need to have lots more cases of Jason Sharples. We need lots more cases of Jennifer Baker that the Minister was talking about. Equity kids who come through to really run the world. So that's there'll be probably things I've thought of in the thinking that I've forgotten in this short time. And I think now I should also say that the Accord panel, with the exception of Barney, is fading, and the people you should be really listening to are the implementation committee, to Verity, to Barney, well and truly supported by Ben and the department. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and I forgot one thing. I forgot to say one really important part of our thinking was recommendation 1. And that was the objective. And that includes the equity side. That the objective, we say, should be that to set a clear vision for the tertiary education system, both higher education and vocational education and training. The Australian government specified that the objective of the national tertiary education system be to underpin a strong, equitable and resilient democracy and to drive national economic, social development and environmental sustainability. There you have it, equitable and resilient, and that's what we want.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Okay, that's pretty comprehensive. Wonderful, thank you for that. We've got lots to get stuck into. I'm going to look straight to the next speaker. If you want to just take us away.
Yes, sounds good.
Maybe 5 or 6 minutes, just sort of set out your stall.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess I'm here speaking on behalf of a lot of practitioners across the sector. EPHEA represents over 1,000 staff who are working inside universities at the coalface directly with students to increase access and to support students to succeed in their higher education studies. One of the things that I will draw on, Mary, is you mentioned the 4 equity groups, and I think there has been overwhelmingly a really positive sense amongst practitioners, that there's a lot of great things in the accord. And but we know from a practitioner perspective that the devil is in the detail. It is how these recommendations are subsequently implemented, and what gaps or what opportunities does that leave on the ground when we're working directly with students. So to draw specifically on the 4 equity groups, we talked a lot about, you spoke about disability is featured very heavily in the accord. We heard Minister Clare speak about the need for reframing, how that's positioned. We've got regional, rural and remote students, First Nations students, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. But I was very, very pleased to hear you touch on that these groups are not homogenous, that across, amongst our student cohorts are extremely diverse, and there's a range of reasons that impact a student to be successful in accessing higher education, but subsequently to progress through their degrees as well. So we know students from care leaving backgrounds, they're one of the most at-risk groups in completing their higher education qualifications. Students from our Pacifica communities, refugee students, students from the LGBTIQA+ communities. Our student cohorts are really, really diverse, and when we're designing elements like needs-based funding or other aspects around support, that we need to be looking at our student groups as a really diverse group, that and that each individual comes to higher education with their own set of needs in order to be and therefore requires really differentiated, personalised support to enable them to succeed. So I think it's really easy as a sector to be able to go, okay, well, how are we going to support low socioeconomic students? Well, we're going to, obviously scholarships are a tried and tested initiative, and we've got colleagues in the room who have done a lot of research around that, but the barrier for one student isn't always the same as the student sitting next to them as well. So we need to really make sure that we're doing personalised, individualised approaches to student support, and that we're bringing what is seemingly these invisible barriers amongst a lot of our students really up and highlighting these, so that as an institution we're building our capacity and our knowledge as a sector around how to best support these students as well. So I think there's a range of things that we could do. We don't monitor a lot of these student groups. We don't know who these students are in our universities, and so we would be very much in favour of universities having to report on how diverse our student cohorts are beyond the 4 equity groups as well. We'd also be, I guess, really interested in institutions having a level of autonomy and universities having a level of autonomy to really tailor approaches that meet the needs of their diverse student cohorts. We heard Harlene speak about incarcerated students in Curtin. So to be able to have the opportunity for universities to really look at what does our cohort look like, and how are we going to best support that cohort in a way that may look very different to the university that's 50 kilometres away from us as well. So when we're looking at what works, absolutely we need to look at what works as a sector, but we also need to look at what works from a place-based, community, student-based approach as well. And when we look at other countries, Aotearoa, the National Centre for Tertiary Teaching Excellence, They have developed a priority learner matrix, so it really has shifted the rhetoric around equity being a deficit to looking at the strengths and that the richness of what a diverse student cohort brings to our institutions, and looking beyond those 4 equity groups to really look at, well, you know, what are the characteristics of our student cohort and how can we really embrace that diversity. So I think that's something, certainly from a practitioner lens, you know, we're sitting with students every single day. No 2 students are alike. Every single student has a different set of needs, and so we need to implement reforms and implement policy that enables for that personalised, individualised approach.
Kylie, thank you for that. Okay, we're definitely going to come back. Just gone on the Red Book. Verity, off you go.
All right, so I think the Accord was a quite magnificent document. I really enjoyed it. I think it's recommended a lot of really good things. But as we saw listening to the Minister this morning, it's sort of now that rubber hits the road. It's going to be the implementation of the Accord where we'll actually see if and when and how we create change. It was interesting, the question that came from over here about public and private schooling, but also listening to the Minister talk about why the needs-based funding model for Gonski has still not been implemented. And that's quite amazing. Like, it was 2011 or something, and it's over a decade and it's still not implemented. It's far from being implemented in public schools. And what is the reason that this is the case? Well, because it's incredibly complex and difficult, and because there's such things as budgets, because it's such things as the states and the different negotiations with the states and territories and them making either matching commitments or not making matching commitments, but also because of really quite powerful sectoral interests. One of the things around Gonski in particular was the government at the time made a really, political decision that there be no losers. So they basically said to Gonski, there's going to be we don't want any losers in this, which meant that no non-government school could lose any funding at all, which of course meant that the cost suddenly skyrocketed to be able to deliver that growth in funding for public schools. And since then, there's been a lot of sectoral interests in maintaining government funding for non-government schools. So it's really complicated, difficult policy. And I think one of the things we've got to do as a sector is making sure that needs-based funding in higher education doesn't enter that same quagmire of budget restraints and complexities and sectoral interests and universities not operating as team players in this. That's one of the reasons why I'm excited about the creation of the ATEC. I know not every university is. People worry. Like, universities naturally don't want to be too constrained or regulated, and there's good reason for that. Like, at the same time, I don't think I'm part of a vocational education and training review in New South Wales, and I think the TAFE sectors are too regulated. They are really the amount of regulation and hoops that they have to jump to be able to deliver virtually anything is ridiculous. And if you're going to have a agile and responsive training system, you need to not be over-regulated. So I don't think we want to go down the same road for universities. But at the same time, what I think is needed in this country is a repository of truth, in inverted commas, for want of a better word. We need an organisation that actually has the capacity to understand deeply higher education and the tertiary sector as a whole and have the data insights to do that. That's something that I see Jobs and Skills Australia beginning to deliver, and will deliver even better under the magnificent leadership of Barney Glover. But you do see it, right? Like, you see Jobs and Skills Australia developing the data capacity, the in-depth insights and the expertise to advise government and industry in the sector. That's what we need ATEC to deliver. And hopefully ATEC can be like the honest broker, right? I really liked what Mary had to say about getting rid of marginal funding. So having the trust of the sector and of the system through their expertise to be able to understand costs, to be able to know what the baseline is, because needs-based funding only works where you're able to actually agree on the baseline cost for the typical student. That's what needs to be agreed. What does it actually cost to to deliver education to the, in inverted commas, typical student, recognising everything that Kylie's just said, and then the loadings on top of that, and what do those loadings look like, and what will it cost, right? What does it actually mean in terms of additional investment from government? Because at the end of the day, we are going to actually have to have additional investment from government, and that's something in some ways they've been managed to sort of, you know, avoid for at least another year by setting up the implementation committee, but there will need to be additional funding. We never reached the funding that Bradley recommended for equity, right? Bradley recommended 3% or 4%, says Nadine. Thank you, Nadine. Good to have an expert in the room. 4% of the Commonwealth grant scheme to be done for equity. We never reached that. There's different modelling, but basically the latest modelling out of UA is saying 160 million deficit a year from what we should have been receiving every year in terms of equity funding. So we don't want that to happen again. It basically can't happen again if the government wants to actually achieve not just its participation rates, but its success rates. So there is going to have to be a certain holding them accountable to making sure that the money is actually there when the rubber hits the road, which is also, don't get me started, but another reason why they need to be a bit careful about going hard on the international students, because unless they're prepared to fully fund the cost of teaching, unless they're prepared to fully fund the cost of research in this country, and maybe they are, maybe it's going to be the grand renationalisation of higher ed, but if they're not, at the same time, they cannot be saying, cutting off what is not just what I believe, yes, it's got revenue raising opportunities for universities, international students, but it's also a really rich and wonderful export industry. What is better than to be the country that educates people in our region, that has this not just soft power, but actually has this capacity that all our young people grow and learn alongside each other in the region? If that isn't a wonderful industry, I don't know what is. And the government are going to have to start realising that too. So the other thing I was thinking about needs-based funding, and I'd be very interested to hear from the views of people in the room about this, because Mary also raised it around the roadblocks, because what we find as equity practitioners is, whilst of course it's going to be important to make sure that the experience of all equity cohorts in our university are rich with great transition pedagogy, thank you Sally Kipp for all your work in that space, that have the supports, the sense of well-being, the case-managed approach, all of those things that make them succeed, that make all students, but particularly equity cohorts, succeed at university. What we also know that it's still the bread and butter issues that are the biggest problem for low SES students. It's the youth allowance rate, it's the study rate, it's the fact that in capital cities it's really expensive to live and to buy food. And if we don't get those fundamentals right, again, you're not going to be able to drive those participation rates. So again, if the government isn't going to be seriously looking at lifting the rate of youth allowance, and recent research out of ACSES and UNSW says that households with youth allowance recipients are in fact the poorest households in Australia. They're below even the poverty line that exists for those in other welfare payments. So if they're not going to be doing that, maybe our needs-based loadings have to also be thinking about accommodation, transport costs, and those more basic costs. And last but not least, because I don't want to take up too much time, I love the 27 million for the tertiary harmonisation, but I'll let Barney talk about that. Enabling courses is probably the one that excites me most. I think that's a real game changer. I think the goal to allow up to 30,000, basically what they imagine will be 30,000 new places in enabling courses, is wonderful. It helps solve that access piece. And it also means that we can get, hopefully, greater distribution of equity cohorts across the sector. Because I do think it's important that all our universities, wherever they are, actually have greater mix of cohort. The education funding shows in schools, but it's the same in universities, that uplift in outcomes also comes from mixed cohorts, and we want to make all of our universities have greater mixed cohorts. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, okay. Very good. I was going to ask you what you really thought, but no. Harlene, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Shamit. And I'm a late ring-in for this panel, so I haven't done a huge amount of preparation. But what I thought I would do is to just start off. I'm a psychologist by training, but I am a storyteller by nature. And I often tell stories in public situations like this because they tend to, like the minister, tend to ground people in what my perspective might be. So I was the only person in my family to ever go to university, and my parents were all, I didn't have problems with aspiration raising because my parents were always keen that I would attend university, but when the time came for me to go, there was absolutely no way they could have paid for my tuition or my living costs. I was incredibly fortunate to receive a scholarship from an anonymous donor. So the fact that I'm actually sitting here today is literally due to the kindness of a stranger. And there are very few days over the last 40-some years that I haven't really reflected on the huge privilege of my university education. It literally changed my life and obviously the lives of my children forever. And I do have felt, I mean, I have never been out of university since I was 18 years old. And I feel this huge obligation to give back to the communities in which I have lived and the universities where I have worked. So my own equity experience, I think, does bring a lens to my enthusiasm for many of the recommendations in the Accord. And I'm really proud to be leading a university in Australia that actually draws its name from the Honourable John Curtin, who I'm sure many of you know was a major social justice warrior and a big equity champion. So really, equity has really been at the heart of everything that Curtin does from its inception. So the Accord for us isn't a change in direction. It's just the opportunity to do more of the kinds of things that we're highly committed to doing. So I am, as I said to the minister, I really congratulate the funding for enabling places. I think it's incredibly important to reach out to the most vulnerable members of our community, and that includes folks who are in incarceration. You know, if you want to have a really both bad and good day, spend a day in an Australian prison and actually speak to some of the individuals who are living there. Many of the stories that I've heard since I have been at Curtin are ones in which this entire society has failed them. And I can tell you that many of the people that we currently have incarcerated here are exactly like you and I. And, you know, I often think, there but by the grace of God go I. You know, they turned right when I turned left, but many of the decision points that they've had were very similar to ones that I faced in my life, and that might describe some of you in the room today. So the more opportunities that we can give people who are really, really suffering to change their lives, the better off we are. And certainly those enabling pathways will be a great way for many of the students who the minister said are not finishing high school. That will be great for them, but it will also be incredibly powerful for those folks that we have incarcerated. I mean, I think, you know, again, I do tell stories, and the story that about one of the women that I met, I was in one of our Western Australian prisons at Christmas time. We were running a small graduation ceremony for both our incarcerated students, and Professor Paul Brunton, who's our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and I, we rocked up to the prison in our academic regalia, and we had a wonderful ceremony supporting the students who had finished programs at Curtin, but we also celebrated people who were getting a forklift ticket and their barista certificate, and, you know, anybody who was engaged in education, we were there to support them. And one of the young women who had just finished our Aboriginal enabling course through the prison, you know, she, in her speech, she said how grateful she was to Curtin because, you know, she'd left school at 13, she had dyslexia, she'd spent her whole life with people, including her teachers, telling her that she was stupid. And so she left school and, you know, obviously got with the wrong men, did a whole bunch of stuff that she's obviously not proud of, and therefore she is currently in prison. But she said that the good news here is that when I got here and I wanted to participate in the enabling course, Curtin actually assessed my learning disability, and I've actually had the opportunity while I've been studying in prison to have a few extra minutes for my testing. And she said, and she did use these exact words, she said, "Isn't it ironic that I had to go to prison in order for someone to actually diagnose my learning disability. Now, for me, that was a huge sort of slap in the face about all of the different ways that we fail people in our community. So I think these enabling courses, whether people are in prison or whether they're just on the dole or they're just in difficult situations, will be a great way for all of us to sort of lift people out of what will obviously be poverty if they can't get on the right path to education. And the second thing is, I am really excited about the needs-based funding. And I need to say that both because of my own background, but also because I am the chair of the board of ACSES. And that's really what we're on about. And I think, again, I support Kylie's, we really need to figure out what works. Shamit's referred to ACSES as the What Works Center. We now have this unique opportunity in history to actually turn things around. We can either squander it or we can actually do something really good. And I would strongly encourage everyone in this room to work with ACSES and other similar kinds of organizations to really determine what works, because we have limited funding available and we need to help as many students as we possibly can. And I know that Shamit and all of the other ACSES staff who are here today are highly committed to working with you and your universities to develop those bespoke programs for students with different kinds of needs based on either research that's currently being conducted or the international best practice literature. So I think I'll leave it there, Shamit.
Thank you. And last but not least, Barney is going to get 5.5 minutes. Off you go.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Shamit. I'm really pleased to be here. I wanted to pick up a number of the recommendations where I think, and I appreciated the comment from the Minister this morning when he emphasised that this was the first stage of the implementation of the Accord recommendations. And although it's 27 out of 49, that's not the end of the discussion, and I hope
29 out of 47.
29 out of 47, thank you, Mary. 29 out of 47. Who's counting? It actually is important to count. Because it does give us a chance, I'm sure Verity and I at the Implementation Committee and Ben as well, an opportunity to prosecute the case for a number of others that the government has yet to make a decision about. But the particular area and the particular recommendations I wanted to focus on were recommendations 11, 4 and 36 for those who are into the detail of the Accord. 11 I quote a great deal as a recommendation because it goes to the heart, and Mary's mentioned it, and the stories that Harlene has been telling reflected. 11 is about aspiration and lifting aspiration. Mary also mentioned recommendation number 1, that we need a national tertiary education objective. And I agree with that. And the words that took some crafting on the part of the panel with the support of the department, it took us some time to land that. Mary was very keen for a sharp national tertiary education objective to mirror objectives in other sectors, which actually do drive policy. People need to reference this. We need to hang our policy decisions around the objective. And if you're in conflict with it, there's a problem with your policy setting. So it's actually really important. One of the reasons I was attracted to the Jobs and Skills Australia in the Act is a similar, very powerful statement about why JSA would exist, and Verity touched on this. It exists to provide the advice to government to enable all Australians to be uplifted, to participate fully in the labour market of the future, to their full potential. So it's a strongly equity-based organisation. And I think when I think about the responsibilities JSA has, and Verity's given it a nice plug today, I appreciate just how important it is to have a joined-up tertiary education system in this country. And the word tertiary was another much debated topic on the Accord panel. Why are we talking about tertiary? This is a university review. But it very quickly became clear that you can't talk about skills, you can't talk about harmonisation, you can't talk about uplifting equity groups to participate if you don't talk about the tertiary education system. And I talk a great deal now about the national skills system. These things are very integrated, although at the moment clumsily so because of history and a whole range of other challenges. But if you go to 11, 4 and 36, 11, and the ordering, of course, was important in the Accord. There is method in the madness of the Accord report. But 11 is about aspiration. And I've, in this job in 5 weeks as a JSA Commissioner, I've had the joy to go out and talk to a whole range of people about Australia's national skills system and the role JSA plays. And I've had the opportunity to talk to apprentices in particular. Ian Ross and Lisa Paul are doing an apprenticeship review right at the moment. And we need to watch it really carefully. It is an extraordinarily important review. And I've talked to many people in the manufacturing sector, in the energy sector, in the food sector, the construction sector, around their needs. And they reflect on the importance of apprenticeships and they reflect on the importance of skills and just how dramatic the situation's becoming in Australia when we look at the skill shortages in those spaces. But you also have a chance to talk to young people who've chosen an apprenticeship pathway. And I've been fascinated to talk to them. And this is not an easy pathway to choose in this country. And it should be an easier pathway to choose. And it comes back to what are we doing in schools? Mary's comment a moment ago about early childhood is a critical part of that. What are we doing in schools, right back in school, to lift aspiration to tertiary education? The 80% attainment target is a tertiary education target. 55% of 25 to 34-year-olds will need to have a university bachelor's degree or above, but we're going to need to have a great deal of participation in tertiary education broadly and vocational education and training in particular. These two sectors have to work much better together to achieve that very ambitious target over the next 25 years. Just to think the next 10 years. You don't have to wait 25. So we need to lift aspiration in our schools. And recommendation 11 was partly to do that. It was partly to say you cannot achieve any of this if we don't have Brennan and O'Brien and O'Kane, the Irish reviews of education in this country, working in tandem. We're waiting on Brennan and the Productivity Commission. I must say I'm very proud that the Jobs and Skills Australia is doing a very significant ECEC study at the moment. That's early childhood education and care, to look at the workforce challenges of that sector, many implications for universities as well as vocational education and training providers, and the intersection of the two. But we have to uplift aspiration in schools. We have to get young people thinking about opportunities. We need the expert career advice that we recommended. We need to see the government consider the National Skills Passport. And I know that from Western Sydney in this room, and the comments this morning from Jason, he's always very, very generous in his comments about this building because he looks at it every day when he's in his electoral office. And he's very proud of it, as we at Western Sydney University are very proud of it. And it is a beacon, and it is sending a message to this community in a range of ways. And you can see it, I think, from outer space. It's a very, very bold vision on the ground. But it's very much about saying there are wonderful opportunities. We need great careers advice. And the people of this region, for the young people, perhaps with an educationally disadvantaged background, coming through, they need a skills passport. They need a jobs broker. They need a way to help them with the social capital to get that first step into the labour market. So 11 is very, very into tertiary education and into the labour market. 11 is a really important recommendation. And I think the government, and I hope the IAC will pay more attention to it. 4 is about a more flexible and responsive skills system. Skills occur a lot in this report. 208 times equity, great. Count the number of times we say skills. And I guess for higher education, that's sometimes a bit of a challenge. But there's a lot in that. Accelerating acquisition of skills, recognition of skills, visibility of skills. AQF reform. You can't think equity without thinking AQF reform. The National Skills Taxonomy. We have to better understand the interface between vocational education and training, higher ed, and the overlap between the two. And the National Skills Taxonomy will help in that regard. That's about tertiary harmonisation. TAFE is at the heart of reform in VET in this country. TAFE uplifts equity groups much more strongly than universities do. So there's a message there for all of us in this room about how we can work more powerfully together with our colleagues in the vocational education and training sector. We need to align our data practices, which takes us to recommendation 36, which is data measurement and reporting. And Mary's emphasised this, and so has Verity. One of the great opportunities for me in the last 5 weeks with JSA has been to give a whole lot of public presentations. And I decided to do that jumping into JSA because it's one way to get into the detail of it when you're about to be in front of hundreds of people talking about the labour market and you're not an economist, so you better get it right. But one piece of data has just stuck with me. And it's a piece of data that came out of what's called the VET National Data Asset. And Verity knows this data asset because a very, very powerful administrative data set with the Commonwealth links together a whole range of data sets, ATO, DSS, NCVR and others. And Vanda put out, VET National Data Asset, a report on the 2018-19 VET completions data. So it had a look at those students who completed one VET qual, one of the top 100 VET qualifications, and just looked at what happened to them pre and post. Pretty simple study to do, but now you've got this data set that's extraordinarily deep and powerful. And one piece of data stood out to me. This, by the way, when this was published, it didn't get a lot of attention. I didn't know why it didn't get a lot. It got a little bit of criticism, in fact. What were the journos who criticised it focused on? They were focused on median income after VET qualification, and it wasn't high. But if you looked at it for students with a disability, 60% of them are employed actually pre a VET qual. That went up 12 percentage points post. That's important. That's a shift. Median income went up about $6,000 to $7,000. That's important. Income support reliance dropped from 51% to 23%. One VET qual makes a difference. That sort of depth of data analysis about the effectiveness and the efficiency of our tertiary system is what Verity is talking about, what we need to drive really high quality, robust decision making. I want the JSA and the ATEC to survive, as the Minister does, through multiple governments of any political persuasion. Well, that'll be on the back of the quality of the research they do, the quality of the analysis they undertake and the quality of the recommendations they make and the robustness of it. And I think when Vanda is expanded to take into account more of higher education effectiveness and efficiency, looking at that overlap to pick up business data through one of the big data assets of the Commonwealth at the ABS, Blade, then we start to see the power of data. And what the ATEC, which is for Mary and I something that's so important, day one in January of 2026, I hope they've got some very, very impressive data to work on to help inform their decision making. And to use a word, I'm pretty sure the Minister used it this morning, Mary did as well, to steward the sector. This is all important because you can't talk about equity if you don't get into the detail of these really important parts of what works, what's effective. You know all of this, you're all practitioners in this space. But focus on VET. Tonight, when I have a chance to talk to those of you who come to the dinner, I want to explore what harmonisation really means and how we can actually benefit from it. So that's my 5.5 minutes. Thank you.
We have a panel with very elastic ways of counting. But anyhow, it's great. It's great. I've listened patiently and jotted down things. Now, look, time is always against us, and it's always a losing battle. But I'm going to indulge the role of the chair and at least say, ask one thing, and anyone can jump in. Okay, keep it quick fire. You know, a minute answer at most. And I heard a couple of themes, but here's one, more or less where Barney landed at the end. But it's resonated down the panel. Everyone keeps on saying, if my hearing is good, they're saying that measurement, reporting, and dare I say accountability is part of the secret sauce. I need no persuasion. And I saw a lot of nodding heads all around the room when you're making that sort of essential point. And so can I just get a sense of, anyone can jump in this, what degree, look, let's go back. We've got universities that pride themselves on their autonomy, all right? You want to put vice-chancellors and professors in charge of their business, most people seem to think. But on the other hand, we want to get somewhere by 2040 and whatever, where some of these equity indicators are happily going up and staying there, okay? So how much more accountability and reporting and monitoring do you think is going to be needed? Is it just, will it just sort of happen magically? Or are we going to have to sort of roll our sleeves up? And I'm kind of looking for Verity to get that going. But anyone can jump in. 1 minute on that. Any individual. Verity, 1 minute. Do you want to?
I do think accountability is really important, and I think it's important in the equity space in particular. So we do need mechanisms to make sure that, particularly when there's funding involved, like needs-based funding, that universities are delivering that funding for what it's intended to deliver. So I think it's extremely important. How you do that, always complicated, and that's where the rubber will hit the road and be in the detail. But harping back to what I said before, ATEC should help us deliver that, right? And you've got to get a sense that the sector will trust that ATEC as well. So it is a relationship of trust that needs to exist between both the sector and ATEC. But I think the sector, there'd be no one in the sector who would argue that there should be no accountability, I hope, on government funding, particularly when it comes to equity cohorts and any new spending and funding.
A comment.
Yeah. 1 minute, go on quickly.
I think we need to look hard at the data collected on higher ed. I think that's an important part of the run-in to ATEC and ATEC. And the whole idea was to cut administration. So how do we automate a lot of this process? How do we reuse and do data fusion? There's lots of, where data science has moved on so far, we need to use it well in higher ed. But we do need to collect data, and I agree with Verity. I think most people want to be accountable.
Okay, closing, last 1 minute contribution from the panel. Closing. Okay, 1 minute.
I just find it interesting. We've had a lot of word count discussions today about how many times equity is raised. The one word that is missing from the Accord is empathy. And I think in all of the counting of things that we're doing and all of the funding, we certainly don't want to step away from understanding that at the base of any of these decisions are individuals. So I think as we go forward, it's really, that's why the storytelling that the minister does is, I think, so incredibly important, because it locks it back to a given person. And those of us who have to balance budgets and report to TEXA and everywhere else, sometimes the individual gets lost in that story. So I would just encourage all of us, I completely agree with accountability, but I think it also has to have a huge dose of empathy on top.
Can I jump in on 1 minute?
Yeah.
If I was given more time, I would have delved into a few other recommendations, which I'd like. I know I've only got a minute. I think the government, with the racism survey, that was an important step to take. I think the not commencing a First Nations review in higher education, something I hope they can reconsider. I think it would be timely to do that. Putting First Nations at the heart of the review was an important thing for the Accord panel, and there are a number of recommendations. First Nations students having access to medical places under a demand-driven system, for example, and I can understand that hasn't been picked up by government, but self-determination for First Nations people in higher education, and I've noticed some conversations from colleagues in the sector recently. I must say I'm encouraged by that, and I know Western Sydney University wants to play a key role in that, and I hope that that becomes something, because it's going to need a new way of looking at some of our regulatory challenges and burdens.
Excellent. Okay, right. Questions from the floor.
I'll just go one more.
Okay, go, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to go on.
I was just going to say, absolutely accountability. I agree with everything Verity said back to the government, but I think we've also got an accountability to our students as well. And so I think, we had a question in the room earlier around the placement prac grant, and the fact that some students are being included in that practicum grant and others aren't. And so I think we've also, I don't think we can go through the Accord and go, oh, well, tick, that's been addressed by the government. I think we need to, we've got a role as practitioners, we've got a role as leaders in our higher education institutions to say, well, placement poverty, as an example, is a national issue. The government is doing this, but we've got a responsibility to our students in our institution. What else do we do to contribute towards that? How do we change our processes? How do we shift some of our other funding mechanisms to prioritise that as well?
Very well said. So I've got microphones poised there, and I think one there. I'm glancing. Who would like to ask a question? Just say who you are as I catch your eye, and I'm also going to keep an eye on Slido. Please go ahead.
Awesome.
And who's it to?
Good question. So my name's Evie. I'm a master's student at Deakin University, but I'm also the Deputy Chair of Children and Young People with Disability Australia. And what we hear all the time from our members across the different stages of education, but particularly about tertiary education, is that attitudes that have low expectations for students with disability are the biggest barrier to students succeeding in their education. And I'm so glad to hear that aspiration building is very much central to the pillars of the Accord and the pillars of work going forward. But when I read the Accord, I see the opposite for students with disability. What's happened with the way, and my colleagues in the room know I'm always going to be the person who points out the elephant in the room. I don't apologise. What's been hinted at throughout the day so far is the data collection around students with disability, and the way that's been modelled by the department is really poor. And it makes the assertion that students with disability are participating at the level that we'd expect for population parity, which is incorrect for a whole range of reasons, and I won't bore you with the data science, but if you'd like to chat about it, let me know. But I suppose my question around all of that is, how can we as a sector, both in the implementation of the Accord and in the other work that happens around higher education reforms, how can we make sure that we don't continue to perpetuate these low expectations for students with disability? How do we make sure that particularly students with profound disability, that's the terminology from the ABS, not my own, students with profound disability aren't left out of this conversation? And how do we make sure that the fact that there is no growth target in the Accord for students with disability doesn't reprioritise our efforts towards that particular issue away to other issues that are mentioned in the Accord?
Okay, so Mary, briefly just on that, yeah?
So first of all, we were very startled by the data, and it was late in the piece, so forgive us. It's great the discussion's happening, that's one point. But I think the answer to your question is a much more nuanced and deeper discussion about aspiration. We need to make sure universities, everybody in the community has high aspirations for all Australians. And that is whatever somebody wants to do, they should be supported in. And I think talking about that, writing about it, is just not just using the word aspiration, but what does it mean and what does it turn into, I think is something we need to say. This is, I was saying, more R&D in the whole equity space. That's a really important part of it.
Okay.
Just building on that, Mary.
Briefly,
yeah. When we're out, I'm seeing a lot of colleagues who work out in schools, and when we do work with 6 and 7-year-olds, they do have aspirations for themselves in terms of where they see themselves, and those aspirations are often quite high. There's not many 6 or 7-year-olds that we speak to that say, I don't know what I'm going to do when I finish. They want to be astronauts, but there's something that happens in the education system along that journey that reduces that. So I think it's not that our students don't have high aspirations, but there's something about how our systems operate and how our organisations operate that that means that they decline over time.
Okay,
yeah.
well, let's move on. I've got a question down there, and if it's to an individual panel member, it would help, yeah.
Yes. I'm Penny Jane Burke. I'm the Director of the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle, and I'm also UNESCO Chair in Equity, Social Justice and Higher Education. And I just wanted to raise a question about the way that we're talking about aspiration. So to think about, first of all, what do we mean by aspiration? What values are at play when we think about whose aspirations count and matter? We've talked about how people's lives are changed through higher education, and often that's about the desire to actually give back to communities. So it's not necessarily an individualized aspiration to make a better career for myself or have better skills. That might be part of it. But I think a lot of the students that I have worked with over the 30 years that I've been in the space of conducting research and practice and teaching for equity have given me the sense that aspiration has a whole range of different expressions and that we need to learn from those expressions. I also think that we need to think about what are the conditions in which different forms of aspiration can be realized and also recognized and represented in the space of higher education. So that means that we need to think about equity in higher education much more broadly, not as particular individuals who we construct through equity groups, but through thinking about what are the systems and structures and practices and orientations as an institution that we want to nurture and sustain over time. So I guess the question for me is, how do we sustain a more equitable educational system that includes higher education and that represents the interests and the values of the different communities that we serve in our different regions across the country? And I suppose as part of that, as UNESCO chair, how does higher education see itself in Australia as supporting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which include, for example, reducing inequalities, building gender equality, and eradicating poverty as key goals? And I see higher education as central to that. So that kind of repositions our kind of thinking about what equity in higher education might mean for the future.
Holly,
so it's a big question, but...
Holly, just come back to that briefly, yeah?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer one of the many issues that you raised, and that is around, I think, people being self-determining in terms of what success looks like for them. One of the conversations that we've been having at Curtin recently is how we report on our students' success. And traditionally, it has been about degree completion. But what we've learned by speaking to our students, particularly the 30% of our population who are equity students, is that sometimes success looks like coming to university, doing a few units, maybe a semester, and then getting a great job, one that you never would have been able to put your hands on had you not done that bit of training. So in terms of the national statistics, that looks like a failure. That student has failed because they didn't complete the degree that they signed up for. But we're trying to reshape our own measurement tools so that we can acknowledge those kinds of activities as success. And I think particularly in this early phase, as we're trying to increase the number of equity students who are studying at our universities, we need to walk the journey with them, not at them, and that our own sort of hubris should not get in the way of individual students' definition of what success looks like for them.
Okay, so I'm just going to go online, then I'll bring in Paul, and probably we'll land it after that. So there's one question that cropped up quite a lot, I think, online, and I'm just going to slightly phrase it. So the question says, we're at risk of creating more harm by making universities compete on increasing access and equity. How do we avoid that? How do we want to make sure that they're... So it's counterintuitive to some of the points being made, actually, along the panel. And you can kind of see the point that was being made if you just cut to it, okay? Yeah. Does someone want to just come in on that very quickly? Quick comment, please.
Jump in really quickly. I mean, I'm hopeful that the ATEC will play a crucial role in trying to dampen rampant competition and start to manage the system as a whole. And hopefully you'll have an ATEC that is committed to stewardship and not intervention into the system, and to work individually with institutions about their mission and about their opportunity to reach out into their communities to support equity students. It's vital. The Accord, amongst many things it was premised on the fact that we believe in the system we have. We believe in the importance of regional universities, and if Fiona was here, she'd be emphasising that. We want those universities to thrive, and we can achieve that if we don't replicate 15 years of unplanned, unmanaged growth in the system. We start to have a more steward-focused and managed system. I think the ATEC can do it. I think it can assist us, and I can think that we can avoid that rampant competition problem.
Okay, so we're definitely going to be coming back to that in further discussions and when you speak this evening. Paul, unless I can see anyone else, I'm going to get you to have the last question. And who do you want to ask it to?
Thank you. Great opportunity with members of the Accord panel and the Implementation Advisory Committee. No one's talked about job-ready graduates, even though we know it has disproportionate impacts on equity group students. So as we move forward and we're developing this new funding model, how do we think about building JRG reform into that?
Oh, gosh.
Okay, well,
look, it is, if I could jump in, I think it's fundamental to the role of the ATEC again. Yeah. It's a pricing authority. Yeah. I think what the government has done, is Ben here?
Yeah.
Ben? I think what Ben would say, this is a big statement, Ben. He may not say this.
Go for it.
But I think there's a very clear role for the ATEC very quickly to start looking at the pricing and costing of higher education in the system. And that's where JRG reform would come in advice to the government about resetting funding cluster rates and other associated matters of cost. I think that's the methodology that we felt was crucial, because actually resetting funding cluster rates is a really complicated challenge, and I'm sure that the IAC in the next few weeks will begin to look at that in the context of needs-based funding.
Anyone? That's fine?
That's my view.
That sounds good.
Okay, it's in ATEC. Any other further comments? Last going. Okay, Nadine, you've got the last word, and we will cut it. Go on. Just keep it brief.
Thank you so much. I will. Nadine Zacharias from Equity by Design. I'm going to pick up on needs-based funding, Verity, and a bit of Barney. So I just quickly ran the numbers, thanks to the very helpful briefing note we got from ACSES that, $1.9 billion had been spent on HEP since its inception in 2010. That's 127 million a year. And Verity, you said there was 160 million we didn't get. So we got less than 50% than what we were meant to get. But the question goes to the fact that the needs-based funding, as it's currently conceived in the report, is split between student-based and delivery-based. And at the moment, there seems to be an indication that the regional funding is to be delivery-based, and all the rest of it is going to be individual, student-based. And I think there's real tension in that, because as equity practitioners we work on both. We work on the structural and we work on the individual, and I think again students with disability is a beautiful illustration of this. We only have to make individual adjustments because our core business is not inclusive. And so the universities need delivery-based funding to make our core business more inclusive for all of our students, and then we think about the adjustments we need to make on top. So I wonder if that has been a consideration in the discussions around needs-based funding.
Absolutely, it had been. And I don't think we think it's the last word. I think this is something that should be discussed here. It's a really important point.
Okay, we done? Yep. Good. Okay, so we've gone slightly over. I have indulged the role of the chair. Apologies. I'm going to do it again, but I'll take 30 seconds. So I still think the discussion around aspiration, starting early on in schools, so people are seeing the next generation, the returns to education, whatever level that takes you to, is probably underdone. It's probably still underestimated. It seems like a kind of vague wish. We've got 15 seconds. So we may want to sort of develop that a bit further. I'm looking towards Barney, maybe expanding on this evening. I don't know what your comments are going to be. But there's a real risk that we might have just sort of assumed that, we will sort of supply will create its own demand. The WSU story here. You build a campus and people keep on coming and keep on coming. And that becomes sort of the generalised story we tell of higher education across the country. I suspect it's not true in places that are quite different from Western Sydney. And it's good that it's true here, but it might be a bit of a thin assumption to make when you take into account 5 states and territories running their systems, and some universities a long way from the population density of where we're sitting right now.
There are 6 states in Australia.
And territories.
and territories as well.
But my point is, Australia's not flat. Right? My point is not flat. So there's a big assumption in terms of building up the question of future demand for higher education, that aspiration, which probably will have to come back to time and time again. That was my last comment. I went on for slightly more than 30 seconds. I apologise. We're going to adjourn now with some slight hope of keeping to the timing of the programme. Can I just ask you to thank the panel for their contributions?